Hi! Welcome back to Soft Static Files and the series that I call The Lore. When you hear the word fairy, you probably picture something small. Delicate wings, glitter, flowers, maybe a tiny woman sitting on a mushroom somewhere in an enchanted forest. And honestly, that's probably exactly how they would want you to picture them. Because long before fairies became harmless creatures in children's stories, the folklore surrounding them was much stranger and much darker. They could be beautiful, they could be monstrous, they could be everything that you can imagine. Some looked human, some didn't. They could reward you, they could deceive you, they could lead you somewhere you were never supposed to go. And according to centuries of folklore, sometimes the safest things that you could do when you encountered them was to leave them alone. Don't disturb their places. Don't interfere with their gatherings. Be careful what you accept from them. Be even more careful about what you promise them. And if you find a perfect circle of mushrooms growing in the grass, maybe don't step inside. Because the creatures we now call fairies were not always imagined as tiny, sparkling beings waiting to grant wishes. In Ireland, Scotland, Britain, and across European folklore, stories developed around beings that existed somewhere between our world and another. Different cultures gave them different names, different appearances, different rules. And importantly, there was never one single universal mythology of the Fae. What we have instead is something much messier. Centuries of stories, beliefs changing from village to village. Older traditions colliding with Christianity. Folklore being written down, rewritten, romanticized, and eventually transformed into fantasy. So tonight, we are going backwards, before the fairy godmothers, before Tinkerbell, before the wings and glitter. Back to the hills, the forests, the strange music heard somewhere in the distance, and the people who believed that some places were better left undisturbed. This is the lore of the Fae. The first problem with talking about the Fae is surprisingly simple. What exactly is a fairy? Today we use the word as though it describes a species. A fairy is a fairy. We think we know what one looks like. Small body, human face, pointed ears perhaps, usually wings, but historically, things were nowhere near that simple. The English word fairy developed through Middle English forms such as fairy, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry, influenced by Old French. And originally, the word didn't necessarily describe the one tiny supernatural creature. It could refer to enchantments, a supernatural realm, a state of magic, or the beings associated with that realm. Over time, the meaning shifted, and under the enormous umbrella of fairy folklore came creatures that looked nothing alike. Some were described as tiny, others were human-sized, some were breathtakingly beautiful, others were grotesque. Some lived alone, others appeared in enormous groups, some were connected to houses, some to water, some to hills, forests, or ancient places. Some might help a human being, others absolutely should not be trusted. So when we talk about the Fae, we're already doing something people in earlier centuries wouldn't necessarily have done in exactly the same way. We're taking hundreds of traditions and placing them under one convenient name, and those traditions don't always agree with each other. That matters, because there is a modern tendency to turn fairy folklore into a rule book. Never do this, always do that. This creature belongs to this court. That creature has this exact weakness. But folklore doesn't work like a video game. There was no official handbook. A belief recorded in one part of Ireland might be completely different from a story told in Scotland. A creature considered dangerous in one tradition could behave very differently somewhere else. And the stories themselves changed over time. Which means that throughout this video, whenever we talk about a rule of the Fae, remember that somewhere, someone probably told the story differently. And perhaps the most important difference between modern fairies and their older counterparts is this. They weren't necessarily cute, and people didn't necessarily want to meet them. One of the most fascinating things about fairy folklore is the language people used around these beings, because sometimes they avoided naming them directly. In Irish tradition, you encounter terms translated into English as the good people or the fair folk. There are similar euphemistic names elsewhere, and at first that sounds affectionate. The good people, almost friendly, but a flattering name doesn't necessarily mean the beings themselves were considered harmless. Sometimes politeness is a form of caution. If you believe something powerful might hear you, perhaps insulting it isn't a particularly good idea. So instead of describing these beings as dangerous, malicious, or unpredictable, you speak respectfully. You call them good, you call them fair, and then you hope they leave you alone. One of the most important Irish terms connected to fairy tradition is Aosi, and I don't know if I have pronounced this correctly because I think I'm saying this in every video lately, but we have different names, so yeah, I have to warn you about my pronunciations. The term is associated with the Sidhe, another word again that I didn't know how to pronounce. The mounds or hills strongly connected with the supernatural inhabitants of Irish tradition. And this gives us one of the defining images of Irish fairy folklore, the hill. To us it might look like nothing more than a mound in the landscape. But in folklore, certain hills and ancient places could function almost like borders. Not necessarily doors you could physically open, but places where the separation between this world and something else felt thinner. And that brings us to the other world. The fairy realm isn't always another planet. It isn't necessarily another dimension in the modern science fiction sense. And it isn't simply heaven or hell. In many stories, the supernatural world exists disturbingly close to ours. Sometimes beneath a hill, across water, beyond a mist, inside a place you have walked past your entire life. The boundary can feel almost ridiculously small, and yet crossing it changes everything. Irish mythology contains numerous conceptions of an otherworld, including places such as Tir na Nog, the land of youth. And one of the most famous stories associated with it concerns Oisin and Niam. I think I have heard these words somewhere else, and I'm pretty sure I have pronounced it completely incorrectly. Let's continue. Niam, I don't know how to, I'm sorry. Niam comes from the other world. She takes Oisin with her to Tir na Nog. There are age and time do not affect him as they would in the human world. There, age and time do not affect him as they would in the human world. Eventually, Oisin wants to return home. He is warned not to touch the ground. When he reaches Ireland, he discovers that the world he knew is gone. Generations have passed, and when he finally touches the earth, the years catch him all at once. Whether we classify every element of that story as fairy folklore in the modern sense isn't really the point. The motive is what matters, because it appears again and again in supernatural traditions. Time is dangerous on the other side. You might believe you've been gone for a night. The human world may disagree. And there is something uniquely frightening about that idea. Not being killed, not being attacked, just coming home and discovering that there is no home left to return to. Your parents are gone, your friends are gone, everyone who remembered you is gone. And you haven't changed at all. This strange relationship with time would become one of the recurring motifs surrounding encounters with the fairy world. And there was another way people were set to cross that boundary. Sometimes they followed the music. Music appears constantly in fairy folklore. Beautiful music, impossible music, music heard at night when there should be nobody nearby. In some stories, humans stumble upon gatherings of supernatural beings dancing. Sometimes they join them, and that can be a mistake. Because once again, time becomes unreliable, and a dance that seems to last only minutes might consume hours or years. The person inside the experience may have no idea what is happening outside it. There is something almost predatory about the idea. Nothing grabs you, nothing drags you screaming into the darkness. You hear something beautiful. You become curious, you walk toward it, and you go willingly. Which is a pattern we'll see repeatedly with Fae. Danger does not always look dangerous. Sometimes it is beautiful, sometimes it offers you something. Sometimes it invites you to dance. And sometimes it leaves a circle behind. You've probably seen one, a nearly perfect circle of mushrooms growing in grass. Today we know why they form. A fungus grows outward underground through a network called mycelium. I think this is the word. Oh my god, I think this is the hardest video to ever record because there are so many words that I don't know how to pronounce. Sorry for the interruption. Let's continue. As it expands, mushrooms can appear around the active outer edge. Over time, this creates a ring. Perfectly natural, perfectly explainable, but imagine finding one hundreds of years ago. A circle appearing in a field overnight. No footprints, no obvious human explanation. Just mushrooms forming a boundary in the grass. Folklore supplied an answer. Fairies had danced there. Across parts of European folklore, mushroom rings became associated with supernatural gatherings. And depending on which story you are hearing, stepping inside one could be dangerous. You might be compelled to dance, you might become trapped, you might lose track of time, you might encounter beings you were better off never meeting, but again, there isn't one universal fairy ring tradition. Different regions develop different explanations and warnings, and the scientific explanation doesn't make the folklore less interesting. If anything, it tells us something about how folklore works. Human beings encounter something strange, we look for patterns, and when nature produces something that looks almost deliberately constructed, we imagine a constructor. A circle needs someone to draw it, music needs someone to play it, and an ancient mound perhaps needs someone living inside. So what did the Fae actually look like? The irritating answer is almost anything. There is no historically consistent fairy body. Some traditions describe supernatural beings with extraordinary beauty. Others describe creatures that are old, distorted, or frightening. Some are diminutive. Others are effectively indistinguishable from humans. And that's something modern imagery has largely erased. The tiny winged fairy became enormously influential through literature and art, particularly as fairy imagery became increasingly romanticized. Shakespeare helped shape the English literary fairy. Later writers and Victorian artists pushed the imagery further. Fairies became smaller, more delicate, more closely associated with flowers in childhood, and wings became increasingly common. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the transformation was well underway. The frighteningly unpredictable supernatural neighbor had gradually become something that could live comfortably in a children's book, and eventually, Disney gave us Tinker Bell, which is a remarkably public relations campaign for an entire category of supernatural beings. Because if some of the older stories are to be believed, approaching one because she looks cute would be an absolutely catastrophic decision. But beauty itself was never evidence of safety. In fact, sometimes beauty was the problem. A supernatural being could appear desirable precisely because that made approaching it easier. The beautiful stranger, the impossible music, the feast, the dance, the invitation. Again and again, curiosity becomes the doorway, and this is where we need to talk about the rules. If you've spent any time in modern folklore spaces online, you've probably encountered lists. Rules for dealing with the Fae: don't give them your name, don't say thank you, never accept food, never make a deal, carry iron, don't step into a fairy ring, and whatever you do, do not follow the music. The problem is that these lists often take beliefs from different places and different centuries, combine them with modern fantasy conventions, and present the result as ancient Celtic law. It isn't. There is no universal Fae constitution. However, several recurring ideas really do appear across fairy traditions. And the first is reciprocity. If you receive something, something may be expected in return. Hospitality matters, promises matter. Breaking agreements can have consequences, and supernatural gifts aren't always as simple as they appear. Food is another recurring motif. Eating or drinking in supernatural places can bind a person to that place in some traditions, although the exact never eat fairy food rule varies considerably depending on the story. Then there is iron. Iron has a long association with protection against supernatural beings in British and Irish folklore. Objects made from iron could be placed near vulnerable people or locations. But even here, the internet has simplified a complicated body of folklore into fairy plus iron equals damage. The actual traditions are much messier. And then we have names. Modern fantasy loves the idea that giving a fairy your true name grants them supernatural power over you. It's an excellent story device, but presenting that exact rule as a universal ancient fairy belief would be misleading. Name certainty carry power in folklore and magical traditions, but the highly specific internet version of never tell a fae your name owes a lot to later storytelling and modern fantasy. The same caution applies to saying thank you. You will often see people insist that you should never thank a fairy because it implies a debt. There are traditions surrounding reciprocity, etiquette, and appropriate treatment of supernatural beings, but the clean little rule circulating online is much more confident than the historical evidence allows. And I actually think the uncertainty makes the folklore better. Because imagine trying to interact with something whose rules you don't understand. You don't have a manual, you don't know what it considers rude. You don't know whether accepting a gift creates an obligation. You don't know whether refusing it is worse. You don't know if it's telling the truth, and you don't know whether the story your grandmother told you applies to the thing standing in front of you. That is much scarier than a list of 5 rules. And now we need to address 2 words that appear constantly whenever people talk about the Fae online: seelie and unseelie. Modern fantasy often presents these as 2 clean opposing factions. The seelie court are the good fairies, and the unseelie court are the evil fairies. Light and dark, good and bad, choose your team. Actually, folklore is unsurprisingly less cooperative. The terms are particularly associated with Scottish tradition. Seelie carries associations with blessed, fortunate or happy, and Seelie represents its darker counterpart. But Seelie means safe is a dangerous simplification. Even supernatural beings considered more favorably disposed toward humans could still be unpredictable. They could take offense, they could punish, they could demand respect. The difference isn't necessarily, these ones love you and these ones want you dead. It's closer to different categories of supernatural temperament and behavior within particular traditions. And once again, centuries of literature and modern fantasy took something fluid and gave it borders, which is understandable. Humans like categories, good, evil, safe, dangerous, but folklore rarely behaves that nicely. Sometimes the beautiful thing is dangerous, sometimes the frightening thing helps you. Sometimes the good people are called good precisely because nobody wants to find out what happens when you call them something else. And perhaps the most practical rule surrounding fairy folklore was also the simplest. Leave certain places alone, a lone tree, an ancient mound, a particular path, a ring in the grass. Places associated with supernatural beings could become protected not by fences but by stories. Don't cut that tree. Don't build there. Don't disturb the mound. Don't block the path. Maybe people genuinely feared supernatural retaliation. Maybe stories preserved older cultural memories about important places. Maybe they protected landscapes that communities considered significant. Probably, depending on the place and period, the answer was different, but the result was the same. The landscape itself acquired a personality. There were places you could use and places you respected, places you entered and the places you passed quietly. Because perhaps the hill wasn't empty. Perhaps the tree belonged to someone. Perhaps the path was still being used, just not by you. And if all of this sounds strangely restrained for a video about dangerous supernatural beings, that's because we've only been talking about what happens when humans accidentally enter their world. We haven't talked about what happens when they enter ours. Because sometimes, according to the old stories, the fair folk didn't wait for someone to wander into a ring. They came to the house, they came to the bedside. They came for adults, and sometimes they came for children. They took a human child away and left something else behind. Something that looked like them, something their parents were expected to believe was still their child. A changeling. And that belief would eventually have consequences far more horrifying than anything we've talked about tonight. But that's for part 2. Until the next file.